Okay, we're going to talk about the Atari VCS, the new one, and the history of Atari and the video game crash. This is the Retrospection podcast.
Oh,
So-
we got some stuff today.
Tell me about it. Tell me about what you know about the VCS. What
Are we going
crowd-
to talk about that yet?
Oh, okay.
First, we just want to talk briefly about E3. Mainly Nintendo. We're both pretty good Nintendo fans, I'd like to say. Can I
Yeah.
speak on your behalf?
Yeah, and we can't do a podcast like this without at least discussing the E3 that for us just happened yesterday. So, at the time of this recording.
So, I listened to E3 at work while it was happening, and I work washing cars pretty much, so I can't really, watch, but I was listening. And I was pretty freaking excited, because the main thing that Nintendo featured, as everybody knows, was Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. As you see here, there is a slew of characters on the screen, and that's because they're bringing everybody back. What do you think about that?
It's exciting. I watched the video. It gave me tingles, little goosebumps.
Oh.
If you're a Super Smash fan, this gave you goosebumps probably. It's pretty exciting. They're not. I mean, the developer, I forget his name because it's some
Frick.
Japanese name, but he's said that they aren't
Sakurai.
focused a ton on the on new characters because they spent so much time doing all the old characters. He also mentioned something I didn't really think about ever before, was the fact that every time they add characters, or for every character, they have to have a version of that for Kirby.
You
Which
know how many
is-
freaking Kirby models there has to be in those game files?
So, I mean, they have to remake every character for Kirby, pretty much. Or remake Kirby for every character. Anyways, that's exciting news. Do you have anything else to add on it? 'Cause-
I just think the most exciting part of having every character is just there are things you kind of forget about. Like, we used to play Melee a lot in our late childhood, I guess.
Yeah.
You could call it that.
our teens, perhaps.
Yeah. And
Early teens.
there's a lot of characters. Like Dr. Mario, did he return in the Wii U? I think he did. But we didn't really
play the Wii U
one.
one a ton.
Brawl
'cause-
was the main one, but there are things you forget about, like all the stages for Melee, all those characters, like Young Link's back. I don't know. I think part of the reason I got tingles from it is because of the nostalgia from it.
Yeah, and I'm excited to have a lot more maps and to be able to turn off interaction
Stage,
because
what are they called? Stage hazards.
yeah,
That's the biggest one.
because I mean we avoided those levels, which means there was a limited amount of levels, and it was always fun to have some of the older levels, but it seemed limited. Even on the Wii U, it was like I wish there was more of the old levels on the Wii U version. Though
Yeah.
2 times I played it. But
And if you think about it, they're also including the Final Destination and the Battlefield versions for like every single map. So, did you get that part?
no.
So, say like you have the Mario level, because like there's a Final Destination that's just flat, and then there's the Battlefield which has the platforms. I think if I'm either that or it's switched, but
I don't know.
it's flat with 3 platforms, and those are kind of like the hardcore Smash levels. And then now they've made it so like you can take the style of, say, the Mario Sunshine level. Like if you like the music for that, you can take the style of it and put it onto either Final Destination or Battlefield. So you're not playing like the same dark, overly epic map, but you have the same specifications in a map, like
Okay.
as far as distance and platform size and stuff. But
That'll be interesting to see that, because I'm not sure I understood everything you said. But
We'll find out in
digress.
December.
yeah,
And,
I will find out on December 7th.
oh yeah. Oh freak.
Okay, so
That's gonna be a physical purchase for sure.
yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about the new Atari.
The subject at hand.
That's right, the VCS. That's weird. What do you know about it?
So, the VCS was started. It was mentioned a while back. I don't remember what date, but Atari came out of nowhere basically, and they were like, "Hey, we are going to make a system." And they basically went out to the community and were like, "What would you like to see in a system?" And they took in feedback, and then they created a crowdfunding
Okay, wait.
for.
So I
a
didn't
system.
know if they took. I don't know a whole ton about it. So they took feedback.
I don't know how much feedback they actually took. That's just what they said they were gonna do.
Okay.
So,
So here's what I know that the funding started on like I don't know May 30th ish.
it was pretty close. It wasn't far away from today's date.
So they have several models, some of which, or I guess several packages
They
that
have
they plan.
2 models.
Two different models, but
yeah.
several different packages. So they have the one
Yeah.
with #real wood.
Real wood. Whoa.
Okay, so they have that, and then they have the one without. They have them that come with a controller or a joystick or both.
There's a lot of combos you can do. You can be like system and joystick, system and modern controller, system and modern controller and joystick.
Well, some people thought it was weird that they would sell it with that they would
It's
have a price point without the controllers, but
Yeah.
I don't see that as an issue because they're putting support on for various controllers. So if you already have a controller you want to use, why pay for a controller? That's one of the few things that to me wasn't a red flag out of all the red flags that I've heard people talk about. There's many.
Support for controllers is a good thing.
But I don't know. I thought there was excitement before they went on Indiegogo because, I don't know, nostalgia for the Atari for people, not necessarily for me because I wasn't born
So, yeah.
during Atari's prime.
Part of the excitement for me was just, I don't know, I think it's kind of exciting to see somebody jump out and try to compete, because we've got like the three or four, if you can include PC, the 3
Right.
consoles, and they're like unbeatable.
That's the thing that I saw as exciting was like, okay, we've got Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo. Okay, maybe Atari's going to try and compete in that market. But based on what I've seen, that doesn't look like a market they're trying to compete in.
Not at all.
I mean, for $200,
It's a really cheap. The Switch is $300. I don't know what the Xbox and the PS4 are right now.
I'll tell you what I think. To me, what I think it feels like. It feels like an underpowered Steam box.
That is what it sounds like. So, for a little bit of background information as to what the system's going to be running, it's going to be Linux, and it's going to be their own. It's based off of Ubuntu, if I understand correctly.
I don't know. I just saw Linux distribution, but from what I can tell, it looks like it's going to be Linux with their own little GUI. I mean, essentially, what are they making? Just a GUI for Linux?
It's like, yeah, it's just like the different visual styles of Linux, only Atari's made their own in their own box. So
the price point tells me it's going to be not very powerful. I mean, the Switch is 300. It has a screen on it. I could imagine it having similar specs to the Switch. The problem is, it sounds like they're leaning towards almost PC games because it's Linux.
Yeah.
And the Switch does not have the hardware. Okay, you have the specs actually, so
I don't have the Switch specs. Let's see.
no, not for the Switch, but you have the specs, so it's probably more powerful than the Switch. But
so what we're looking at is a 4 gigs of DDR4 RAM. I think, where is it at? Right there.
That brings up the price.
DDR4. It should have stuck to 3. I don't know.
Here's what they're touting: these specs: 4K, 60 FPS,
3.3 gigahertz processor. I don't know how many cores or threads that has.
Well, 4C4T excavator. That might tell us, but I don't know what that means. So, I mean, we're not digging too deep into the specs. If you want to know more about the system itself, you can look it up. We're just here to talk about the philosophy of the system more than anything.
Yeah.
I don't see it being a big success. Honestly, when they came out with the Indiegogo, they had this stuff shown, and the only thing they had shown on the system was some arcade games, and they kept relying on the vault that you can get for $10 on Steam. I mean,
Yeah.
so
So
why did people donate to this? How did they get so much money for a Steam box?
it's hard to understand. Our initial reason to talk about the VCS is we wanted to talk about something new and compare it with its past, and determining on its past, would the new thing be successful?
Well, and that was the plan, and then what was interesting to me is the more I found out about it, the more it seemed like a Steam box. And if we want to look at the past of the Steam box, okay, you've got an underpowered... Well, okay, the Steam box actually wasn't underpowered if you bought, like, the Alienware computer.
But
it was very powerful.
That was still,
but
$500? Something like that? 4, 5?
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but they had a couple...
Maybe it wasn't, I don't know.
I think 500 might have been the cheapest one. I can't remember, but it didn't do well because you can't just stick a GUI on Linux and call it a console and be able to sell it, especially since most computer games are still only
PC.
Windows supported.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if they want to, I don't know.
It's really confusing to me. They went out and they got I don't know if we got a picture of what their companies they have helping them for launch. You know, like Nintendo will get their third parties.
I don't
going.
think I have a picture of that.
Their third party lineup to help them kind of support the system and make stuff for it just isn't strong. They're all names I've never heard of.
Okay, well, as I don't know, there's not like millions of people that have been funding this. It's
it is
a
a
very
GoFundMe.
small amount. It's thousands of people. Like, I don't know. Like a week ago, it was like 10,000. And if like, who's gonna build a game for a console that might only end up in the hands of 10,000 people? Like, that's not very many people. There's 300 million people in the United States.
Yeah, it's
So,
not the greatest of numbers.
but I mean, first of all, they pushed for, or one of their advertising methods just continually was, it has the Atari Vault. Well, I can get the Atari Vault for $40.
You can get it on a lot of
I can
different
get-
platforms.
Right. I mean, I have the internet, so. I mean,
Yeah.
this is $40, a flashback here. But as far as I know, you can get it on Steam for around $10. You can get all those games. So,
Yeah, $200, $10.
the last thing I need is another, gaming computer that's as powerful as my laptop, which I don't game on because it doesn't game well.
Yeah. Not to mention how easy it is to make a Raspberry Pi emulator that, heck, you could hide anywhere. People wouldn't even know it was there.
Yeah.
So,
But let's compare it to the old back in the day when the market crash happened, right? We have the Atari 2600. It had been out a while, but it was definitely around its prime in 1980.
yeah.
And then the video game crash happened, which there's a lot of debate and speculation on what caused the crash. Some people even claiming the crash didn't really exist. I looked into that. My opinion is that it did. You'd have to be stupid not to see that there was a crash, which doesn't mean that games disappeared entirely, but they were really hard to get. I read an
Yeah.
article of someone who lived in Silicon Valley at the time. They were a kid, they loved games, and during the crash, they couldn't get games. They lived in Silicon Valley.
Yeah,
And,
so definitely a hard time because hope was lost for that market, and who would want to sell games for a dead market? I can't even think of an analogy.
A lot of companies went out of business. Some of the few companies that started before or about the same time as the crash and survived were computer game companies, and they all took things a different angle. They didn't mass produce garbage, which leads us back to the Atari. At the time of the Atari, there was an oversaturation of systems in the United States that could play, like, some of them could even play Atari games because it was simple hardware. There was no copyright issue remaking the Atari.
Yeah, and it's interesting to point out, with the saturation of not only third-party systems, Atari had multiple systems out it's called the second generation of gaming history, I guess.
Yeah.
They had, here it's listing 2. I thought there were 3, but the most prominent one is the Atari 5200, which wasn't very popular at all because it wasn't backwards compatible with 2600 games. And 2600, to give you kind of an image, it was like, I don't know, like NES. The NES blew up. Like, it did really well. The 2600 was like Atari's best. And like, they peaked like right at the start and fell.
Well, the Atari 2600, Atari pretty much, I think the 2600 specifically, but I could be wrong, but Atari at least had pretty much 80% of the gaming market in like 1982. And they were oversaturating it themselves with different consoles and stuff. And when you have a console, the Atari 2600, that's so popular for several years with so many games, and then you come out with the 5200 and it's not backward compatible. And I mean, I don't know much about it, but my guess is it wasn't as easy to build a game for as the Atari 2600 was, because as far as I know, that was pretty easy to make games for.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the crash was pretty much caused by a huge oversaturation of the market.
Yeah. There were a lot of games, namely a lot of really crappy games.
Many people attribute the crash to games like E.T., for example, is one particular game that happened at the end of 1982.
E.T. is notorious for being like, it's like the poster child of the video game crash, and
But arguably, it didn't cause the video game crash.
yeah,
It was just a result of what caused the video game crash, if that makes sense.
it's one of the how would I put it? Victims, I guess.
It's the result of what caused the crash. It's
Part of
just part of the result.
Snowball.
With the crash. And people have put it as the worst game of all time. But I've heard many people that were actually around during that time, because I wasn't, that said that, and I can believe this, there were so many games for the Atari 2600, people said, obviously there's games worse than E.T. I mean, there are some terrible games, some crappy, worthless, garbage games. But E.T. is infamous because they overproduced the crap out of it, and then there was the legend of them having to dump it in
landfills.
Which I guess eventually, not too long ago, they
discovered
dug them up just to prove that the legend existed, and it wasn't necessarily that they had 1 million of those games of the E.T. games, because E.T. actually only made up about 10% of the Atari games they found. It was pretty much a warehouse dump because the crash affected everything.
Now, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it was only about 10%. So, that was surprising. But there was a dump of Atari games because the crash, they had nothing to do with it. They had nothing they could do with those games.
Nobody was buying them.
People were returning some of the games. E.T. in particular, people were returning along with Pac-Man, I think. I'm not sure how many
Really?
people.
Okay.
Because here's the thing. Pac-Man... There's rumors that Pac-Man was a beta, and they just released it. You can see on the right bottom is the arcade version, and on the left top is the Atari 2600 version. There's also, I've heard people say it wasn't the beta, that they just released too early, that it was the final production, and that they just made it the best they could for the 2600. I don't know.
Yeah, so that's the thing with the 2600. To me, everything looks like beta on that thing. But that's just because I was born in a time when video games were a bit more artistic.
But I don't know how the specs of the official arcade compare to the specs of the 2600. But people arguably said that the Pac-Man game actually did fairly well. That it didn't do as bad as people think. But, I mean, it's a little underwhelming compared to the arcade. The gameplay is not quite that good, and
yeah, it's worth noting as well what the 2600 came out in 78. Was that the year?
Somewhere around there. Late 70s? I don't know.
It was late 70s, and Pac-Man the arcade was released in 1980. So you can see in these pictures, if you're watching the the major quality difference, and that's only with like 2-3 years.
Well, maybe if they released Pac-Man for the 5200, it could have looked like this.
Well, the 5200 was weird because their controller was like a spinny knob. You just spun this knob, and
Oh, well,
I don't know if that was
why it flopped.
I don't know why that's
kidding.
part of it. Definitely, in my research, that was part of it as well. It also had like what looks like a little number pad. See, here it is right here.
And they can't see it.
So, well, you can, but basically, it looks like it could be a joystick as well. It looks like a joystick too, but I don't know. It's like if Nintendo released something in between the Wii and the Wii U. It's just really quick. It's really quick. But I guess back then, technology was
Or that is the
getting
Wii
better.
U.
Atari's Wii U is the 5200.
That's the Atari's Wii U. The problem is they didn't come out with a Switch. Instead, they
Fell off the face of the planet. They pretty much, after that, they played hot potato with a bunch of companies.
Yeah. Well, and I was listening to that earlier. It's pretty confusing. The company is split in some form or another.
I was reading about it and I was like, this.
It's a headache.
It's
a headache. But
it's a lot of info.
But I almost see this attempt at Atari making another console as like the attempt of companies back in the 1980s, the 1980, 1981, 1982, the side companies trying to make a system to compete with Atari.
And how ironic is that?
Like,
That's.
like, it's pretty much like a gimmicky. I don't know. I don't see it doing well. I don't see it selling that well beyond the people that have already paid into the Indiegogo.
Yeah. I don't know. The problem with it is Linux isn't a very. It's not something people want to make things for, really. Games for. Its user base isn't very big. It's for a very niche. Is that how you say that?
I don't know.
It's a very niche community.
But if they're going to get with companies and get them to make a game for the Atari, then it's pretty much a game for Linux. And there's a good chance any company that's going to remake a game or make a game specifically for the Atari, I would say they would want to release it to all Linux. If it runs on Linux, why close the market up?
So that's another thing, because like, is Atari gonna have their own little store going, or because if they do, people are gonna get a hold of those games and they're gonna put them out. And anyone who Linux is free, you could slap down on your computer, install Linux, and then install just all the Atari shiz that they've released.
We don't advocate illegally downloading games. But
Definitely not.
But it's gonna happen. And
Yeah, inevitable.
so if I don't know, I don't think it's gonna do that well. To me it seems like a gimmick or a scam almost. Like, oh, here, we're gonna get all this money to build you guys, a little something just for old times' sake, and we're gonna pocket all this money.
I want to know what their long-term goals are with this, and like if this is like part of something to get the company more on its feet so that they can do something else, or if they're just kind of like,
I don't see the point of
chucking
an intermediate step. I think if they would have gone full out and made a console that could actually compete with Xbox 360, maybe they would have a hard time competing in that market, but I think they'd have a better chance than with an underpowered Steam box.
Yeah. That's all what it pretty much comes down to with this. So
that I don't think it will succeed. We'll see, I guess. I mean, I probably won't buy one even if it does succeed. Unless there's a really good reason to.
I'm going to be spending money on my Switch. Got Super Smash to get.
Exactly. So, well, we'll catch you next time, I guess. Anything else? Nothing else?
No. Stay fresh.
Like, seriously, shower, people.
Yeah, deodorant, it's real important.
Goodbye.